Welcome to Forum 360 on Fusion, your PBS channel. I'm Ben Rancman, your host today. Thank you for joining us for a global outlook with a local view. The pursuit of energy resources has been part of the human story from the dawn of our species. When our ancestors gathered wood to produce fire for cooking and heat, they too were pursuing energy resources to enhance their health, security, and comfort. While the gathering and burning of wood fuel lasted a remarkably long time in our history, only truly being phased out in the first half of the 20th century, we now contend with a wide array of energy technologies. These range from coal, natural gas, and nuclear, as well as renewable technologies such as solar and wind, that have only recently become commercially viable alternatives. With me today is Dan Bole, a partner at BOW Renewables, a renewable energy consulting firm that specializes in project development. So let's learn some more about energy, how we produce and consume it now, and how our energy production and consumption might change in the future. Welcome, Dan. Thank you for joining us today on Forum 360.
Well, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Great. So I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation. We're surrounded by energy in every way. I mean, we've got this studio here with lights about, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit how you got into the energy field, what your background is, and learn a little bit more about you.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm an Ohio guy. Went to Youngstown State, did a graduate school at Kent, and actually got into basically heavy civil contracting. And then, about 6 years ago, I really saw a trend in the renewable market. I really found a place in my soul where I felt it was where I wanted to be. From a work standpoint, you got to enjoy what you do. So I migrated from heavy civil into a racking and manufacturing firm for solar racks, and then we actually did installations as well. Then about 2 years ago, me and two other partners decided that really where the fun and the battle is with the burgeoning solar markets and renewable energy and all the exciting stuff that's to come is to be on the absolute front line, which is in project development. So we started a small consulting firm, and we've grown in size over the last couple of years, but really been frontline fighting, knocking on doors, and attending local hearings and figuring out what the energy market's like.
Very nice. So I very much look forward to learning more about renewable energy in particular, but I thought it might be instructive to sort of get some sort of sense of where we're at with regards to energy production. I mean, as I mentioned, we're surrounded by energy and electricity everywhere. The moment our electricity goes out, I think most of us feel lost. And
yeah, your phone dies. Definitely lost.
Absolutely, your phone dies, your lights go out, a power outage ever so briefly. It's amazing how reliant we've become, and much of that energy is produced in a variety of different ways. And maybe you can give us a little bit of an outline of a survey of energy production. Sure. Generally.
Yeah, so I think most people understand where our primary energy forms come from. It's kind of the basic mix that's been there, for generations past. Only now the percentages are starting to shift, but you get a steady percentage of energy from our nuclear facilities here locally. They're very well sustained in the energy market. Coal has actually still been a major player. About 8 to 10 years ago, they were significant, maybe the majority power producer in the U.S. Over that 10 years, you're seeing a bit of a downward trend in coal outputs, and you're not seeing a big upstart in new coal facilities being brought online. I think they're down to about 35% nationally. But natural gas has really started to fill a big portion of that gap. Natural gas has been on the rise for probably about the equivalent of the reduction in coal. But additionally, renewable energies is starting to become a major source of energy and output, and nationally it's about 18% of our energy that's produced. So it's grown faster and faster each year, and 2019 looks to be better than 2018 as far as new facilities coming online and new projects being developed. So it's basic spread, but shifting in how big our pie is.
That's great. So I do want to focus, maybe we could drill down a little bit deeper on some of these particular technologies. And so, renewable energy, I've heard it oftentimes referred to as alternative energy, and in some ways it's an alternative to something, but maybe you can kind of tell us the pros and cons of some of the different energy technologies. For example, coal, I think we'd mentioned that 35% nationally. Here in Ohio, I believe it's closer to 50%, 47%.
Yep, which is still down. I believe about 10 years ago, it was about 85%.
Right.
But natural gas, I think, filling in most of that gap. Yeah, I think no energy form is perfect, and each one has its pros and its cons. Some of the drawbacks to coals is really at a time where climate change is on front page news, and it's an international issue, it's a national issue, it's a local issue. It affects how crops are grown, and how kids are aging, and what the general diet could be like. Coal has a high carbon output compared to some of these newer technologies, or even some of the older technologies. But it does produce power regularly, sustainably, and doesn't have the ups and downs of some of the other outputs. Wind is a very economical source of power, and it's got its pros and cons. While there's been some pushback on the aesthetics of wind projects. I personally don't think they're unpleasing to the eye, but maybe that's a biased opinion.
I'm also of the same opinion. When I hear people with sort of this NIMBY attitude towards wind, I've never really quite got the objection to it.
You drive through Illinois, or you hit that I-55 and you see all the wind turbines going. I think it's a pretty exciting scene. To me, it looks like the future.
Right.
And I don't get the aesthetics, but I don't have any on my property either, so maybe
Right.
I shouldn't complain. So yes, but wind's got some drawbacks. It's got a capacity issue as well. I mean, things like nuclear and coal can run at their design capacity all the time.
Okay.
But things like solar and wind do have capacity problems in the sense that can you rely on it when you need it most? And solar does. Solar is a great energy source. I mean, for one thing, the sun shines every day, even in Ohio, in some form or another. But it does, depending on where you're at in the world, it can change the shoulders or the chart. So.
Okay. So we talked about a number of different things. You had mentioned sort of the sun not shining every day, and we can talk about that a little bit about sort of intermittency in renewables, but particularly coal and natural gas, they do produce this steady output. Of course, they have the negative impact of being, carbon producers and emitting into the environment. But what are your thoughts? And I know a lot of people sort of have a very emotional reaction to terms like clean coal technology. A lot of people feel it's a misnomer or a contradiction in terms. But is something like clean coal or something like natural gas, are those possible bridge technologies to sort of bring us to a more alternative future? We can't make this transition immediately, but.
Right. I think, as far as a bridge technology, I think natural gas, absolutely. I think it's going to be something that is stabilizing the grid for years to come. Pretty reasonable source of energy, very economical. And they've also done a lot in the natural gas industry to really shrink their sort of footprint when they're in a neighborhood, in a community. But there still is. It's an expendable resource. It does have a higher carbon output than some of the other renewable alternatives. But coal, I find harder to be a bridge technology. I think I wouldn't say we should be shutting down the facilities that are there. I think from all the people that work at the facilities to the power that is output is important. It's important to the local community, important to the national grid. But when you're looking at it from an economic standpoint, from a clean standpoint, I think the bridge is just about built. And I think that there's other ways to continue forward without maybe reinvigorating an industry that has proved us stable in the past, but maybe isn't the most economical decision in the future.
And that bridge being natural gas, you believe?
I think natural gas is probably more of a forefront into how we get into the next through this transition and into the next generation of energy.
Okay, so we've left out another source of energy, one that elicits a lot of emotion, both positively and negatively, and that's nuclear. And of course, there are those who just the very thought of nuclear is repugnant to them. They don't want to even consider it. What are your thoughts on nuclear? Is nuclear going to be a part, or should it be a part of our national energy diet?
I think nuclear is going to be a part of the national energy diet for at least a short term in the future. I would imagine for a long term, but you're right. it would depend on public appetite, I believe, at some point. The technology creates energy at a very efficient rate, and it's very reliable. You do have to create carbon outputs when you're mining for uranium, and you obviously have a byproduct, and there could be some security provisions in there in the future with the situation that we face daily from a national security perspective. But it's a great form of energy, and one that I think will be part of America's energy use or energy creation for a long time. There's some drawbacks, I think, with some of the current needs and current demands coming online. I mean, you're looking at electric vehicles are being pushed by all of our major vehicle manufacturers. You're looking at an era of everything becoming electronic. Kids don't use textbooks; they use computers.
Right.
As we're sitting in a school facility today. So I think you're seeing a demand increase, and nuclear is a politically sensitive, it's a personally sensitive issue, and those projects to create new technology or new facilities, they have a timeline, and it can be long, 15 to 20 years in the development cycle, and that can, maybe we need something to bridge that gap.
Okay.
Which we could look at some other alternatives, but
Okay.
but it is an important energy source, and I think important to Ohio. Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, my understanding is it's still about 15% of energy production in the state is really coming out of 2 plants, and those plants have, of course, had their share of publicity here with HB6 here in Ohio. But the Davis-Besse and the Perry nuclear power plants, produce a substantial amount of energy for the state.
Yes.
But not without political consequences. As we can see, there's a really live political issue right now with strong adherents on both sides.
Yeah, I woke up this morning to take power back in Ohio, which apparently is the anti-HB6 campaign that's been launched here. So, it appears to be making not only local headlines, but some national headlines, talked about quite a bit in energy circles. In this past year, there's been quite a dynamic energy bill passing. I think if you look at kind of across the Midwest, Illinois had a bit of a similar issue with some aging infrastructure on the nuclear side, and what to do with the growing demand, and how to offset some of the energy coming out of those nuclear facilities. And then Pennsylvania has passed some really interesting. And for me, it's very renewable friendly, so very, very positive legislation, setting renewable goals of 100% by 2050. They've done a lot within their state to drive actually energy into renewable energy in Pennsylvania, which is exciting. And then at the same time, that Illinois passed their RPS program, which incited a big push of solar development in the state. Ohio passed a bill that was a little bit different in structure than what you kind of saw from the neighbors.
Right. And no, that's certainly going to be something, perhaps it'll be a topic for another show.
Yeah.
But I did want to take this time to reintroduce our guest, our topic and our guest. I'm speaking with Dan Bole of BOW Renewables. We're discussing energy production and consumption with a particular emphasis on renewable technology, renewable energy production. And speaking of renewable energy production, that's very much your area of expertise. It's your profession. And really, I think it's one of the more interesting and the more exciting, the more cutting edge technologies. It's an emerging technology that is really only seeing large scale implementation in recent years. And I'd love to learn more about it. Love to learn more about how you envision renewables sort of coming into the marketplace, and maybe let's launch that conversation.
Yeah, well, it is funny, myself included, looked at solar as this new and fancy thing. You look a little bit through history, and BOW, one of our colleagues at BOW has been in solar for 42 years.
Wow.
It's kind of hard to imagine that there was a solar industry 42 years ago.
True pioneer.
Yeah, I mean that's back when Carter was putting the solar thermal panels on the White House. But there is, when you're talking about solar energy specifically, there's kind of 2 camps. There's the solar thermal, and then there's the photovoltaics, which is what most people know is solar.
Right.
And what you've really seen a push and advancement in it is in the photovoltaic market. And there's been a lot of drivers behind that. First, cost of installations have dropped sizably over the last, decade. You're talking, 70+% reduction in installation costs.
Right.
Largely driven on, companies getting better at installing them. Rack manufacturers have more competition. They're making very efficient products. And then there's been obviously some sizable advancements in the module industry, and that has brought pricing down sizable. And then, the inverter technology, all the technology that kind of goes into a solar field now, we've had this sustained growth, 50% annual growth year over year for about 6 years now or something like that. So you're starting to see the competition's increased, the prices have dropped, and now you're seeing a very economically viable energy form. And the meetings, the solar conferences went from kind of tie-dye and Birkenstocks to black suits and business deals. And you're also seeing large investments from major oil institutions into solar developers. Which I always said, if you want solar to be a viable form of energy in the future, you're going to need probably oil money behind it. And, now we know we're here. Solar's in the game to stay. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the idea is that it has to be sort of commercially and economically viable. And with oil prices going some north of 100, all of a sudden people are looking at that $100 a barrel. All of a sudden, solar looks to be like an economic proposition for a lot of folks.
And what's nice is what we do at BOW is we actually get to interact on the ground level. I mean, we interact on the higher levels when we take the business meetings and we do financial deals, and we manage construction projects. But I think the most fun part of the job is that we get to go out and interact with the local community. We shake hands with landowners, with farmers. We try to work out land arrangements where we could lease maybe a portion of their farm field to help put a solar facility in. And it's great. It really gets a sense of, you get a sense of everything, if you ever want to know what's going on in the world, just spend an afternoon with a farmer. I mean, they've really got their ears to the ground about all things. But yeah, I think that's one I feel unique benefit of solar is it really does have a direct community impact. A lot of people get the direct benefit of the product.
They essentially get rent.
Yeah. So that's how most deals will work is, if somebody's willing to partner up with a solar firm, they will enter into a lease agreement for their property. And typical lease range is 25 to 30 years. And at the end, most projects come with a decommissioning bond, and the solar panels and posts and everything come right back out of the ground. The ground's kind of turned back over, and essentially a farmer's got 30 years of topsoil buildup.
Yeah,
and they can go back
it's lied fallow for 30 years.
And we're seeing, to me, it's really great pleasure when you get to see, an older farmer who's dealing with a tough dairy market, and international trade deals have really impacted some of the output and what they're able to get on the open market. And we see that struggle, day to day, and to be able to offer, someone who's spent their whole life working an opportunity to retire at a time when the market's really not helping them out, it's a really good feeling, And that's part of why we do what we do.
That's fascinating. So, I'd like to learn more. So many of your installations are in rural areas. Do you do things in commercial properties, residential properties? And even if you don't necessarily do them, maybe you can sort of tell me. For example, if you're a typical homeowner here in Northeast Ohio and you own a standard-sized suburban house, what would be the economics of having a solar array put up on your roof, and how would that work?
Yeah, well, let me start with sort of the different installation and types of solar. So you've got a few things. You've got C&I, which is we can consider commercial industrial, which is typically like a rooftop or a carport at a commercial facility. Mostly plugged. It's the most easy visualization you can make on solar. It's basically solar on a roof. Directly feeding the facility that it's on, and the facility benefiting from the power that's being generated by the sun. If you step up, there's three. So there's a community solar, which I'll come back to in connection with the residential stuff. Then you have distributed generation and utility scale. Most solar in the news being discussed is basically utility scale, which is above 20 megawatts, which is a sizable project. But then there's another market, which is distributed generation. So it's smaller pieces of land, smaller energy facilities, spread throughout a bunch of different areas, which I have a passion for. It's kind of the market I appreciate.
Speaking of that, it always seemed to me that seems to be perhaps both the blessing and the curse with solar, in the sense that, and maybe you could talk a little bit more. So of course, one of the challenges with solar is sort of this intermittent energy production. Another challenge is the grid, in the sense that when you produce this energy, it goes back into the grid. Maybe our grid was constructed in an era where solar wasn't really a consideration. What are the advantages of being sort of dispersed and distributed throughout in many different small installations? How is that potentially helpful, and how is that difficult, perhaps, to scale up in any sort of large commercial sense?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of advantages to it, especially when you're looking at like city planning or urban sprawl. You can look at sort of point of use of where you have some high electrical demands, and if you can put a facility in closer to help meet some of those needs, you'll have less of a line loss, less infrastructure to get to the point of use. It does make it difficult from kind of a planning and organizational standpoint, and how do we have all these movable assets? But that's one thing where the utilities, really are your ally in how to kind of pull this all off and make it all work. And every time that you want to put a solar project application in, like you would for any power generation facility, you have to coordinate with the grid controller, someone like a PJM who runs the grid for multiple states, and then down to the local utility that you're connecting into, and they all have a say in how that's going to go. And they do a study on it to see if they did tie in a new system here, what would that do to the current system in place. One of the benefits to sort of the distributed assets in the solar assets coming online is that every solar developer puts in an application, and if the project gets approved, they're provided a budget from the utility for how much it will cost to upgrade the system to accommodate the new energy coming online, and the developer pays for that upgrade. So as a resident of the local area, your grid will actually be being upgraded sort of real time as the solar assets are coming on, and it's not it should not be a cost base to them, because the developers are actually paying for that upgrade and interconnection. And then so you mentioned that some of the utilities infrastructure has been in place quite a while. So if you see a solar market or wind market, or even a bunch of natural gas power plants or something coming in online, the system will be upgraded to accommodate for it. And you'll see maybe 2-phase will be upgraded to 3-phase, and those costs are passed on to.
Can you maybe explain what 2-phase and 3-phase is?
Yeah, it's just 2-phase power is a bit of the old way that the systems were set up, but now most systems are running on 3-phase power, and so when you're going to connect in, you actually need a 3-phase connection. And we're in rural areas where those don't exist yet, but now they will when we're plugging in a system. So
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, in a sense, we're being aspirational. We're looking for what our energy policy looks like 20, 30, 50 years down the line, and there might need to be some infrastructure enhancements that are made. I mean, the interstate highway system took decades to build, and we can't conceive of our lives without it now. I mean, it's really, our economy is structured around it, but it was probably in the many trillions of dollars if you take a look at it cumulatively. And the energy grid is another one of those infrastructure projects perhaps that could help enhance the quality of life. But I've really very much enjoyed our discussion. I think we've really only scratched the surface here. I think that there's a great deal to explore. I think you're in an exciting and relevant field, the one that's going to be impacting our lives increasingly in the future. Energy production and consumption is an incredibly complex area of human endeavor. It touches on our lives in innumerable ways. We've come to take the constant and steady availability of energy as a given in our lives. Plentiful, cheap, and steady access to power has brought advancements and dignity to millions. Nonetheless, the production of these sources of energy are not without their downsides and dangers. Like most answers to complex questions in life, there's no magic bullet to sweep away all problems and confusion. Rather, we'll have to grapple with difficult trade-offs and challenges that will require the best minds and efforts of ours and future generations. Today we spoke with Dan Bole of BOW Renewables and hopefully gained some insight into the world of energy, particularly renewable energy. I'm Ben Rancman, your host today. Thank you for joining us on Forum 360, sponsored by the Knight and Akron Community Foundations on Fusion, your PBS channel.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.